Hello, music makers. Welcome back. Have you ever been in this situation? You're trying to reach the level of your reference, but your track just won't get there. Even though things look similar on the meters, you're noticeably quieter, and trying to push it further just results in obvious distortion. And to make matters worse, you can't get your bass as strong as the reference either. Even though, again, it looks similar on the meters, your low end just isn't as solid and deep. Well, that happened to me the other day, and the solution was a lot simpler than most might think. So I was co-producing a track the other day. It was a tech house thing. I've kept all the essential elements here, but I've changed the bass line to protect the original artist. Anyway, a few hours into the session, we decided to do a back of the room test. You know, where you stand at the back of the room for a different perspective. It also helps you hear the low end a little better. And having stood there, we both looked at each other with the same face. Huh? The low end was just hollow. Sounded fine up front, but at the back of the room, gone. Something was wrong. Now also, during the session, I had noticed it was proving extremely difficult to get our track up to the level of the reference tracks. Well, not without obvious distortion, anyway, even though we looked quite similar on the meters. So you can imagine my surprise upon finding out we had less bass as well. Oh dear, oh dear. That's never good news. If anything, less bass should allow you to have more level, and we had neither. Now, here's the really confusing part. We actually had the same kick as the reference. I mean, literally the same sample. The artist who I was working with was a friend of the artist we were referencing. So the kick can't have been the problem, right? It must have been the bass. Well, as all things audio, it wasn't that simple. But while we're on the subject, let's look at that bass. So as you can hear, nothing too crazy. The main two problems with this bass are nothing to do with the sound. The sound the artist picked was exactly what they wanted. Because after all, if we wanted to make the bass a little more audible, we could just raise the filter. But then it doesn't have that subtle underground bumpy tech house vibe. That's not what they were after. No, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with this sound at all. The two problem areas are actually key and placement. The key of our track is actually a few semitones higher than the reference, so that's always going to make it sound lighter anyway. But unfortunately, this brought our bass into a similar area as the kick, so it's competing for space more than the reference was. And to compound that problem is the placement of the bass notes. Most of them are playing on kick hits, which obviously are going to get sidechained. So it's the perfect storm. We have a sound which doesn't have many upper harmonics to cut above the kick. The bass part is playing on mostly kick hits, and the whole thing is in a bad key for that particular kick drum. Now, if I had the choice, what I would do is shift the key of the track and change the bass part. But as a good producer might say, this was not my wedding. The key had to be that because of the vocal, and that particular bass part was working really well with that vocal. Those decisions were kind of locked in by this point. Now, one option was obviously just reduce or remove the sidechain on the bass. But we were already struggling for headroom. As I said earlier, we couldn't get it as loud as the reference as is, so giving up more headroom by reducing the sidechain was not really an option. So that just leaves one thing. We have to look at that kick. So fans of this channel would know that at this point I would just swap the kick, if possible. And I did try quickly, even found some that had a much better low end, but unfortunately none which managed to substitute that old school top flavour. I know I talk a lot about getting the sounds right in the first place. In reality, that's not always possible. This kick was already chosen, for example, but even when that's not the case, if this isn't a plot session and the track has to be finished, and especially when working with others, you can't spend the entire evening getting all the sounds together. And of course, I don't blame the other producer. How were they to know that getting the actual kick sample from the reference would have been a problem? Anyway, it was kind of worth it because it led to my rather creative solution, which you'll see shortly. So let's talk about our options. Option 1. We could pitch the kick. Unfortunately, there's two main problems with that. We'd have to pitch it down to get under the bass. It's already quite high, being one of those old school punchy diver kicks, so we can't really go up. But pitching it down loses what we like about the kick, that initial punch. Not to mention, pitching also changes the length. Pitching it down will make it longer. Even worse for those sidechained bass notes. Now, I'm sure some of you are saying pitching doesn't change length. And no, in certain modes, it won't. You're thinking about time-stretched pitching. I'm talking about the clean way of pitching, without any time stretching or compression. So what happens if we pitch with time stretching turned on? Well, that adds 3 new problems. Time stretching algorithms smear the sound. They kind of blur it. Obviously, some are better than others, but it's a granular process, and that is an unavoidable artifact. That means we'll lose some of the transient and some of the punch as well. As for the second problem, we'll actually lose some low end. What we gain in low end from pitching it down, some of that will be lost from phase cancellation. All the filtering and the looping of the grains from time stretching lead to interference. Some of it constructive, some of it destructive. And guess what destructive interference affects the most? Low frequencies. Now, speaking of destructive and constructive interference, onto problem number 3. It adds level, but the worst kind of level, the one that appears on the meters only. It doesn't actually sound any louder. It's basically the same effect I showed in this video. So that means we lose even more headroom. So to sum up, if we tried that, we'd end up with a kick that was less punchy, less transient, had less bass, and would clip easier, leaving our track quieter. No thanks. Let's look at the next option. So I'm sure many of you in this situation would just probably try to reach for an EQ, boost some of those weak lows, and maybe remove some frequencies to make room for the bass. But believe it or not, we end up with the same problems as pitching. The main problem being the level increase. That's going to eat into that valuable headroom. And of course, EQ brings phase changes, albeit in this situation, probably not enough to be a problem. Speaking of phase, I have had a few questions in the comments asking me how to align the phase of your kick with your bass. So let's get that out of the way. It sounds like something you'd want to do, doesn't it? But just know you don't need to worry about it. It doesn't work. 2 basses? Yes, maybe, but not a kick and a bass. For 2 things to have a destructive phase relationship, they have to be extremely similar. I know kicks and basses are very low frequency, but they're not close enough at all. For those that don't know, kicks don't really have a pitch. Well, most of them don't anyway. See my old video on pitching kicks for the full truth. Something we can try though, which is phase related, is inverting the phase, see if that helps any of the sounds separate. This isn't phase alignment, but it's still worth checking. It's just inverting the polarity of the wave. It doesn't change the sound itself to our ears, but it does change its relationship to other sounds around it. Not much difference here though. Another option you might think about is layering the kick, keeping that flavorful top end but replacing the subs to something lower in pitch. Again, fine in theory, terrible in practice. I avoid layering kicks at all costs. In any fashion, even if they are filtered apart, low end and top end, you can often Frankenstein the perfect sounding kick together. Great click transient, nice punchy chest area, and great sub. However, the phase rotations from those filters and all the phase interferences from combining the different waveforms often betray you in ways you cannot initially hear. In fact, I suspect the sample we have here is already a layered kick because it's displaying all the artifacts of one. It measures loud while sounding quiet. It measures deep, yet sounds weak in the context of the track. Like I say, it rarely works out. Right, well that's about 8 minutes of me ranting about things that usually don't work. Let me show you my little creative solution which did work. Right, see this plugin? STFU? Fans of the channel should know it well by now. For those that don't know it, its main use is a sidechain plugin, like Kickstart, LFO Tool, all those kind of things. This one's free though, but that's not its use today. First of all, I'm going to use it as an oscilloscope, so we can see what's coming out of our sampler here. It's a lot more useful than looking at the waveform in Ableton Sampler. And looky here. The first thing you wouldn't notice from looking at the sample waveform is this. Look at that spike, a massive click at the beginning there. As soon as I saw that, I knew that's where my headroom had gone. You might think that's the transient, but I can tell you from experience, a spike that thin is likely too short to actually hear. The real transient is where the vibrations are bunched up at the beginning here. Now, I could actually try draw this out with the volume envelope, but I don't think we have fine enough control in this particular plugin. By the way, some DAW users like Cubase and Reaper, you can draw this out directly in the waveform editor. Here's my quick and dirty solution though. I'm just going to clip it off. Like I say, if that spike isn't actually audible, then clipping it won't make a difference to the sound of the kick drum. Let's grab Ven Audio's free clip. Perfect. -3 did the job. Let's have a quick listen with and without. Like I said, inaudible. So seeing as my kick was already peaking at 0, that means my entire track could now come up by as much as 3 dB. So that's a headroom problem solved. Let's bring that back up to its previous peak level now, +3. There we go. Oh, by the way, before you all run off and start clipping your kicks, that wasn't the point of this tutorial. I just happened to notice that while I was troubleshooting. Most kicks you come across won't have rogue spikes like that. This only works in that situation. If you try clipping a normal kick, you're just going to get audible distortion and a bit less low end at the same level. Speaking of low end, here's a clever way you can bring it out without damaging the kick. Instead of EQ or the things we mentioned earlier, why not just raise the sub-content where the sub-content is weak in time? That's here. See that slow wobble? That's the sub-content decaying off. And how deep this kick is perceived can be changed by just raising that. Now, many might try to do this with compression, but then we have to deal with all kinds of other artifacts. Trying not to damage the transient or give it another spike. Dealing with the recovery timings and the distortion that those can introduce. No, there's a much cleaner and simpler way of dealing with it. We just need to grab another copy of STFU. What I'm going to do is just draw a kind of counter curve in on here to flatten out the signal. Because we can only take away with this plugin, I'm going to then compensate the level back up afterwards. So then the beginning will be roughly the same, but the end, the sub-content, that will be raised relative to that. There we go. Now we've got some proper subs in this kick. Now, beware, the final aim is not to have this massive sausage-like kick. Well, maybe for some genres, but not here. I will be shaping this later. This is just so I can start from a stronger position. But while we're here, let's have a listen to before and after. Massive difference. Hear how much we've gained in just those 2 simple steps, and that's all without increasing the peak level, so we haven't lost any headroom, and I haven't messed with the phase. But we are not done yet. So that's all the problems with the kick itself ironed out now. But there's still one issue left. Now I can hear that tail more clearly, I can make better decisions in context. And it's obvious it's still sharing some space with the bass. So I am going to pitch this, but in none of the ways we've discussed so far. Just as volume envelopes gave us the control we needed in the time domain, so can pitch envelopes. Built into the Ableton sampler here, you can see there's a pitch envelope. Don't worry, FL users, yours has too. In fact, most samplers do. So now what this is going to let us do is keep that initial punch that we like, but after it's finished that initial diving phase, we can then pitch the tail of the kick to move it into its own space away from the bass. So if I take a quick look at the kick waveform, we can see it doesn't settle into its sub-range until after the 80 to 100 milliseconds kind of range. So as long as I don't alter the pitch before that, we should retain all of that flavor. So set the initial peak to 0. As I said, we don't want any change to the beginning. Then I'm going to set this decay to 90 milliseconds. That looked like enough to let the initial punch through. If you don't know about envelopes, the decay phase is how long it takes to get to the sustain phase. And this sustain bit represents the final pitch we're going to reach. And this amount here, this is like the range of pitch that it's going to give us control over. I'll select 2 semitones here. 2 semitones is going to be fine. We only need 1 or 2 semitones to move this out of the way of the bass. Lastly, we also have control over the curve, the slope of the decay phase. I'll judge that as we listen back. But first of all, let's judge this overall pitch amount. Well, that's definitely working. Somewhere around here sounds good. Let's play with the curve now. Perfect. We've kept the punch, but now the bass has its own space above the end of the kick. Now, because we've gone down in pitch, we have lengthened the kick a bit, something I warned about earlier. But I have these volume envelopes here. I was going to finish shaping the tail of the kick with this anyway, so we can also use this to control the overall length. Something like that. And there we go. A super effective but non-damaging way to fix the low end of the track. Well, as always, I hope you learned something. If you did, you know what to do. Share the video if you think it will help someone, like, subscribe, or if you're feeling extra generous, there's a link in the description to buy me a coffee. And until next week, I will see you in the comments. Bye-bye.